The House by the Headland by H.C. McNeile.
You'll no get there, sir. There'll be a rare storm this night. Best bide here, and be going tomorrow morning after 'tis over.
The warning of my late host, weather-wise through years of experience, rang through my brain as I reached the top of the headland, and too late I cursed myself for not having heeded his words. With a gasp, I flung my pack down on the ground and loosened my collar. 7 miles behind me lay the comfortable inn where I had lunched. 8 miles in front, the one where I proposed to dine. And midway between them was I, dripping with perspiration and panting for breath. Not a breath of air was stirring. Not a sound broke the death-like stillness, save the sullen, lazy beat of the sea against the rocks below. Across the horizon, as far as the eye could see, stretched a mighty bank of black cloud, which was spreading slowly and relentlessly over the whole heaven. Already its edge was almost overhead, and as I felt the first big drop of rain on my forehead, I cursed myself freely once again. If only I had listened to mine host. If only I was still in his comfortable oak-beamed coffee room, drinking his most excellent ale. I felt convinced he was the type of man who would treat such trifles as regulation hours with the contempt they deserved. And even as I tasted, in imagination, the bite of the grandest of all drinks on my parched tongue, and looked through the glass bottom of the tankard at the sanded floor, the second great drop of rain splashed upon my face. For a moment or two I wavered. Should I go back that 7 miles and confess myself a fool, or should I go on the further 8 and hope that the next cellar would be as good as the last? In either case, I was bound to get drenched to the skin, and at length I made up my mind. I would not turn back for any storm, and the matter of the quality of the ale must remain in the lap of the gods. And at that moment, like a solid wall of water, the rain came. I have travelled into most corners of the world in the course of 40 years' wandering. I have been through the monsoon going south to Singapore from Japan. I have been caught on the edge of a waterspout in the South Sea Islands. But I have never known anything like the rain which came down that June evening on the southwest coast of England. In half a minute, every garment I wore was soaked. The hills and the sea were blotted out, and I stumbled forward blindly, unable to see more than a yard in front of me. Then, almost as abruptly as it had started, the rain ceased. I could feel the water squelching in my boots and trickling down my back as I kept steadily descending into the valley beyond the headland. There was nothing for it now but to go through with it. I couldn't get any wetter than I was, so that when I suddenly rounded a little knoll and saw in front a low-lying, rambling house, the idea of sheltering there did not at once occur to me. I glanced at it casually in the semi-darkness, and was trudging past the gate, my mind busy with other things, when a voice close behind me made me stop with a sudden start. A man was speaking, and a second before I could have sworn I was alone. "A bad night, sir," he remarked in a curiously deep voice, "and it will be worse soon. The thunder and lightning is nearly over. Will you not come in and shelter?
I can supply you with a change of clothes if you're wet." "You're very good, sir," I answered slowly, peering at the tall, gaunt figure beside me. "But I think I will be getting on, thank you all the same." "As you like," he answered indifferently. And even as he spoke, a vivid flash of lightning quivered and died in the thick blackness of the sky, and almost instantaneously a deafening crash of thunder seemed to come from just over our heads. "As you like," he repeated, "but I shall be glad of your company if you cared to stay the night." It was a kind offer, though in a way the least one would expect in similar circumstances. And I hesitated. Undoubtedly there was little pleasure to be anticipated in an 8-mile tramp under such conditions. And yet there was something indefinable, incoherent, which said to me insistently, "Go on, don't stop, go on." I shook myself in annoyance, and my wet clothes clung to me clammily. Was I, at my time of life, nervous because a man had spoken to me unexpectedly? "I think if I may," I said, "I will change my mind and avail myself of your kind offer. It's no evening for walking for pleasure." Without a word, he led the way into the house, and I followed. Even in the poor light, I could see that the garden was badly kept, and that the path leading to the front door was covered with weeds. Bushes, wet with the rain, hung in front of our faces, dripping dismally onto the ground, and green moss filled the cracks of the 2 steps leading up to the door, giving the impression, almost, of a mosaic. Inside, the hall was in darkness, and I waited while he opened the door into one of the rooms. I heard him fumbling for a match, and at that moment another blinding flash lit up the house, as if it had been day. I had a fleeting vision of the stairs, a short, broad flight with a window at the top, of 2 doors, one apparently leading to the servants' quarters, the other opposite the one my host had already opened. But most vivid of all in that quick photograph was the condition of the hall itself. 3 or 4 feet above my head, a lamp hung from the ceiling, and from it, in every direction, there seemed to be spiders' webs coated with dust and filth. They stretched to every picture. They stretched to the top of all the doors. One long festoon was almost brushing against my face, and for a moment a wave of unreasoning panic filled me. Almost did I turn and run, so powerful was it. Then, with an effort, I pulled myself together. For a grown man to become nervous of a spider's web is rather too much of a good thing, and after all, it was none of my business. In all probability, the man was a recluse who was absorbed in more important matters than the cleanliness of his house. Though how he could stand the smell, dank and rotten, defeated me. It came to my nostrils as I stood there, waiting for him to strike a match, and the scent of my own wet Harry's tweed failed to conceal it. It was the smell of an unlived-in house, grown damp and mildewed with years of neglect, and once again I shuddered. Confound the fellow! Would he never get the lamp lit? I didn't mind his spider's webs and the general filth of his hall, provided I could get some dry clothes on. "Come in." I looked up to see him standing in the door. I regret there seems to be no oil in the lamp, but there are candles on the mantelpiece should you care to light them. Somewhat surprised, I stepped into the room, and then his next remark made me halt in amazement. When my wife comes down, I must ask her about the oil. Strange of her to have forgotten. Wife? What manner of woman could this be who allowed her house to get into such a condition of dirt and neglect? And were there no servants? However, again, it was none of my business, and I felt in my pockets for matches. Luckily, they were in a watertight box, and with a laugh I struck one and lit the candles. "It's so infernally dark," I remarked, "that the stranger within the gates requires a little light to get his bearings." In some curiosity, I glanced at my host's face in the flickering light. As yet I had had no opportunity of observing him properly. But now, as unostentatiously as possible, I commenced to study him. Cadaverous, almost to the point of emaciation, he had a ragged, bristly moustache, while his hair, plentifully flecked with grey, was brushed untidily back from his forehead. But dominating everything were his eyes, which glowed and smouldered from under his bushy eyebrows until they seemed to burn into me. More and more I found myself regretting the fact that I had accepted his offer. His whole manner was so strange that for the first time doubts as to his sanity began to creep into my mind. And to be alone with a madman in a deserted house miles from any other habitation, with a terrific thunderstorm raging, was not a prospect which appealed to me greatly. Then I remembered his reference to his wife, and felt more reassured. "You and your wife must find it lonely here," I hazarded, when the silence had lasted some time. "Why should my wife feel the loneliness?" he answered harshly. "She has me, her husband. What more does a woman require?" "Oh, nothing, nothing," I replied hastily, deeming discretion the better part of veracity. "Wonderful air, beautiful view. I wonder if I could have a dry coat, as you so kindly suggested." I took off my own wet one as I spoke and threw it over the back of a chair. Then, receiving no answer to my request, I looked at my host. His back was half towards me, and he was staring into the hall outside. He stood quite motionless, and as apparently he had failed to hear me, I was on the point of repeating my remark when he turned and spoke to me again. "A pleasant surprise for my wife, sir, don't you think? She was not expecting me home until tomorrow morning." "Very," I assented. 8 miles I have walked in order to prevent her being alone. That should answer your remark about her feeling the loneliness." He peered at me fixedly, and I again assented. "Most considerate of you," I murmured, "most considerate." But the man only chuckled by way of answer, and swinging round, continued to stare into the gloomy, filthy hall. Outside, the storm was increasing in fury. Flash followed flash with such rapidity that the whole sky westwards formed into a dancing sheet of flame, while the roll of the thunder seemed like the continuous roar of a bombardment with heavy guns.
but I was aware of it only subconsciously. My attention was concentrated on the gaunt man, standing so motionless in the centre of the room. So occupied was I with him that I never heard his wife's approach until suddenly, looking up, I saw that by the door there stood a woman who paid no attention to me, but only stared fearfully at her husband with a look of dreadful terror in her eyes. She was young, far younger than the man, and pretty in a homely, countrified way. And as she stared at the gaunt, cadaverous husband, she seemed to be trying to speak, while ceaselessly she twisted a wisp of a pocket handkerchief in her hands. I didn't expect you home so soon, Rupert, she stammered at length. Have you had a good day? Excellent, he answered, and his eyes seemed to glow more fiendishly than ever. And now I have come home to my little wife and her loving welcome. She laughed, a forced, unnatural laugh, and came a few steps into the room. There is no oil in the lamp, my dear, he continued suavely. Have you been too busy to remember to fill it? I'll go and get some, she said, quickly turning towards the door. But the man's hand shot out and caught her arm, and at his touch she shrank away, cowering. I think not, he cried harshly. We will sit here in the darkness, my dear, and wait. How mysterious you are, Rupert. She forced herself to speak lightly. What are we going to wait for? But the man only laughed, a low, mocking chuckle, and pulled the girl nearer to him. Aren't you going to kiss me, Mary? It's such a long time since you kissed me. A whole 12 hours. The girl's free hand clenched tight, but she made no other protest as her husband took her in his arms and kissed her. Only it seemed to me that her whole body was strained and rigid, as if to brace herself to meet a caress she loathed. In fact, the whole situation was becoming distinctly embarrassing. The man seemed to have completely forgotten my existence, and the girl, so far, had not even looked at me. Undoubtedly a peculiar couple, and a peculiar house. Those cobwebs. I couldn't shake them from my mind. Hadn't I better go and fill the lamp now? She asked after a time. Those candles give a very poor light, don't they? Quite enough for my purpose, my dear wife, replied the man. Come and sit down and talk to me. With his hand still holding her arm, he drew her to a sofa, and side by side they sat down. I noticed that all the time he was watching her covertly out of the corner of his eye, while she stared straight in front of her as if she was waiting for something to happen. And at that moment, a door banged upstairs. What's that? The girl half rose, but the man pulled her back. The wind, my dear, he chuckled. What else could it be? The house is empty, save for us. Hadn't I better go up and see that all the windows are shut? She said nervously. This storm makes me feel frightened. And that's why I hurried back to you, my love. I couldn't bear to think of you spending tonight alone. Again he chuckled horribly and peered at the girl beside him. I said to myself, she doesn't expect me back till tomorrow morning.
I'll surprise my darling wife and go back home tonight. Wasn't it kind of me, Mary? Of course it was, Rupert, she stammered. Very kind of you. I think I'll just go up and put on a jersey. I am feeling a little cold. She tried to rise, but her husband still held her. And then, suddenly, there came upon her face such a look of pitiable terror that involuntarily I took a step forward. She was staring at the door, and her lips were parted as if to cry out, when the man covered her mouth with his free hand and dragged her brutally to her feet. Alone, my wife all alone, he snarled. My dutiful, loving wife, all alone. What a good thing I returned to keep her company. For a moment or two she struggled feebly. Then he half carried, half forced her close by me to a position behind the open door. I could have touched them as they passed, but I seemed powerless to move. Instinctively, I knew what was going to happen, but I could do nothing save stand and stare at the door, while the girl, half fainting, crouched against the wall, and her husband stood over her, motionless and terrible. And thus we waited, while the candles guttered in their sockets, listening to the footsteps which were coming down the stairs. Twice I strove to call out. Twice the sound died away in my throat. I felt as one does in some awful nightmare, when a man cries aloud and no sound comes, or runs his fastest and yet does not move. In it, I was yet not of it. It was as if I were the spectator of some inexorable tragedy, with no power to intervene. The steps came nearer. They were crossing the hall now, the cobwebby hall, and the next moment I saw a young man standing in the open door. Mary, where are you, my darling? He came into the room and glanced around, and as he stood there, one hand in his pocket, smiling cheerily, the man behind the door put out his arm and gripped him by the shoulder. In an instant, the smile vanished, and the youngster spun round, his face set and hard. Here is your darling, John Trelawney, said the husband quietly. What do you want with her? Ah, the youngster's breath came a little faster as he stared at the older man. You've come back unexpectedly, have you? It's a sort of damned dirty trick you would play. I smiled involuntarily. This was carrying the war into the enemy's camp with a vengeance. What are you doing in this house alone with my wife, John Trelawney? Into the quiet voice had crept a note of menace, and as I glanced at the speaker and noticed the close clenching and unclenching of his powerful hands, I realized there was going to be trouble. The old story again, but rightly or wrongly, with every sympathy of mine on the side of the sinners. Your wife only by a trick, Rupert Carlingham, returned the other hotly. You know she's never loved you. You know she's always loved me. Nevertheless, my wife. But I ask you again, what are you doing in this house while I am away?"
"Did you expect us to stand outside in the storm?" muttered the other. For a moment, the elder man's eyes blazed, and I thought he was going to strike the youngster. Then, with an effort, he controlled himself, and his voice was ominously quiet as he spoke again. "You lie, John Trelawney." His brooding eyes never left the other's face. "It was no storm that drove you here today, no thunder that made you call my wife your darling. You came because you knew I was away, because you thought, you and your mistress, that I should not return until tomorrow." For a while he was silent, while the girl still crouched against the wall, staring at him fearfully. And the youngster, realizing the hopelessness of further denial, faced him with folded arms. In silence, I watched them from the shadow beyond the fireplace, wondering what I ought to do. There is no place for any outsider in such a situation, much less a complete stranger. And had I consulted my own inclinations, I would have left the house there and then, and chanced the storm still raging outside. I got as far as putting on my coat again and making a movement towards the door, when the girl looked at me with such an agony of entreaty in her eyes that I paused. Perhaps it was better that I should stop. Perhaps if things got to a head and the men started fighting, I might be of some use. And at that moment, Rupert Carlingham threw back his head and laughed. It echoed and re-echoed through the room, peal after peal of maniacal laughter, while the girl covered her face with her hands and shrank away, and the youngster, for all his pluck, retreated a few steps. The man was mad. There was no doubt about it, and the laughter of a madman is perhaps the most awful thing a human being may hear. Quickly, I stepped forward. It seemed to me that if I was to do anything at all, the time had now come. "I think, Mr. Carlingham," I said firmly, "that a little quiet discussion would be of advantage to everyone." He ceased laughing and stared at me in silence. Then his eyes left my face and fixed themselves again on the youngster. It was useless. He was blind to everything except his own insensate rage, and before I could realize his intention, he sprang. "You'd like me to divorce her, wouldn't you?" he snarled, as his hand sought John Trelawney's throat, "so that you could marry her. But I'm not going to. No, I know a better thing than divorce." The words were choked on his lips by the youngster's fist, which crashed again and again into his face, but the man seemed insensible to pain. They swayed backwards and forwards, while the lightning, growing fainter and fainter in the distance, quivered through the room from time to time, and the 2 candles supplied the rest of the illumination. Never for an instant did the madman relax his grip on the youngster's throat. Never for an instant did the boy cease his sledgehammer blows on the other's face. But he was tiring, it was obvious. No normal flesh and blood could stand the frenzied strength against him, and suddenly it struck me that murder was being done in front of my very eyes. With a shout, I started forward, Somehow they must be separated. And then I stopped, motionless again. The girl had slipped past me with her face set and hard. With a strength for which I could not have given her credit, she seized both her husband's legs around the knees and lifted his feet from the ground, so that his only support was the grip of his left hand on the youngster's throat and the girl's arms about his knees. He threw her backwards and forwards as if she had been a child, but still she clung on, and then, in an instant, it was all over. His free right hand had been forgotten. I saw the boy sway nearer in his weakness, and a sudden flash of a knife. There was a little choking gurgle, and they all crashed down together, with the youngster underneath. And when the madman rose, the boy lay still, with the shaft of the knife sticking out from his coat above his heart. It was then that Rupert Carlingham laughed again, while his wife, mad with grief, knelt beside the dead boy, pillowing his head on her lap. For what seemed an eternity, I stood watching, unable to move or speak. Then the murderer bent down and swung his wife over his shoulder. And before I realised what he was going to do, he had left the room, and I saw him passing the window outside. The sight galvanised me into action, and there was just a possibility that I might avert a double tragedy. With a loud shout, I dashed out of the front door and down the ill-kept drive. But when I got to the open ground, he seemed to have covered an incredible distance, considering his burden. I could see him shambling over the turf, up the side of the valley which led to the headland, where the rain had caught me, and as fast as I could I followed him, shouting as I ran. But it was no use. Gain on him I could not. Steadily, and with apparent ease, he carried the girl up the hill, taking no more notice of my cries than he had of my presence earlier in the evening. And with the water squelching from my boots, I ran after him, no longer wasting my breath on shouting, but saving it all in my frenzied endeavour to catch him, before it was too late. For once again, I knew what was going to happen, even as I had known when I heard the footsteps coming down the stairs. I was still 50 yards from him when he reached the top of the cliff, and for a while he paused there, silhouetted against the angry sky. He seemed to be staring out to sea, and the light from the flaming red sunset under the black of the storm shone on his great gaunt figure, bathing it in a wonderful splendour. The next moment he was gone. I heard him give one loud cry, then he sprang into space, with the girl still clasped in his arms. And when I reached the spot and peered over, only the low booming of the sullen Atlantic 300 feet below came to my ears. That and the mocking shrieks of 1,000 gulls. Of the madman and his wife there was no sign. At last I got up and started to walk away mechanically. I felt that somehow I was to blame for the tragedy, that I should have done something, taken a hand in that grim fight. And yet I knew that if I was called upon to witness it again, I should act in the very same way.
I should feel as powerless to move as I had felt in that ill-omened house, with the candles guttering on the mantelpiece and the lightning flashing through the dirty window. Even now, I seemed to be moving in a dream. And after a while, I stopped and made a determined effort to pull myself together. "You will go back," I said out loud, "to that house, and you will make sure that that boy is dead. You are a grown man and not an hysterical woman. You will go back." And as if in answer, a seagull screamed discordantly above my head. Not for £5,000 would I have gone back to that house alone. And when I argued with myself and said, "You are a fool and a coward," the gull shrieked mockingly again. "What is there to be afraid of?" I cried. "A dead body, and you've seen many hundreds." It was as I asked this question out loud that I came to a road and sat down beside it. It was little more than a track, but it seemed to speak of other human beings, and I wanted human companionship at that moment, wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. At any other time, I would have resented sharing with strangers the glorious beauty of the moors as they stretched back to a rugged tor or two a mile away, with their wonderful colouring of violet and black, and the scent of the wet earth rising all around. But now, with a shudder, I rose, conscious for the first time that I was feeling chilled. I must get somewhere, talk to someone. And as if in answer to my thoughts, a car came suddenly in sight, bumping over the track. There was an elderly man inside and two girls, and he pulled up at once on seeing me. "By Jove," he cried cheerily, "you're very wet. Can I give you a lift somewhere?" "It's very good of you," I said. "I want to get to the police as quickly as possible." "The police?" He stared at me, surprised. "What's wrong?" "There's been a most ghastly tragedy," I said. "A man's been murdered, and the murderer has jumped over that headland with his wife in his arms. The murderer's name was Rupert Carlingham." I was prepared for my announcement startling them. I was not prepared for the extraordinary effect it produced. With a shriek of terror, the two girls clung together, and the man's ruddy face went white. "What name did you say?" he said at length in a shaking voice. "Rupert Carlingham," I answered curtly, "and the boy he murdered was called John Trelawney. Incidentally, I need a doctor to look at the youngster. It's just possible the knife might have missed his heart." "Oh, Daddy, drive on, quick," implored the girls, and I glanced at them in slight surprise. After all, a murder is a very terrible thing, but it struck me they were becoming hysterical over it. "It was just such an evening," said the man slowly. "Just such a storm as we've had this afternoon, that it happened." "But what happened?" I cried, a trifle irritably. But he made no answer, and only stared at me curiously. "Do you know these parts, sir?" he said at length. "It's the first time I've ever been here," I answered. "I'm on a walking tour." "Ah, a walking tour. Well, I'm a doctor myself, and unless you get your clothes changed pretty quickly, I predict that your walking tour will come to an abrupt conclusion, even if it's only a temporary one. Now put on this coat, and we'll get off to a good inn." But anxious as I was to fall in with his suggestion myself, I felt that that was more than I could do. "It's very good of you, Doctor," I said, "but seeing that you're a medical man, I really must ask you to come and look at this youngster first. I'd never forgive myself if by any chance he wasn't dead. As a matter of fact, I've seen death too often not to recognise it, and the boy was stabbed clean through the heart right in front of my eyes. But even so, I broke off as one of the girls leant forward and whispered to her father, but he only shook his head and stared at me curiously. "Did you make no effort to stop the murder?" he asked at length. It was the question I had been dreading, the question I knew must come sooner or later. But now that I was actually confronted with it, I had no answer ready. I could only shake my head and stammer out confusedly. It seems incredible for a man of my age and experience to confess it, Doctor, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was just going to try and separate them when the girl rushed in and— What did she do? It was one of the daughters who fired the question at me so suddenly that I looked at her in amazement. What did Mary do? She got her husband by the knees, I said, and hung on like a bulldog. But he'd got a grip on the boy's throat, and then, suddenly, it was all over. They came crashing down as he stabbed young Trelawney. Once again, the girls clung together, shuddering, and I turned to the doctor. "I wish you'd come, Doctor. It's only just a step. I can show you the house." "I know the house, sir, very well," he answered gravely. Then he put his arms on the steering wheel, and for a long time sat motionless, staring into the gathering dusk, while I fidgeted restlessly, and the girls whispered together. What on earth was the man waiting for, I wondered. After all, it wasn't a very big thing to ask of a doctor. At last he got down from the car and stood beside me on the grass. "You've never been here before, sir?" he asked again, looking at me fixedly. "Never," I answered, a shade brusquely, "and I'm not altogether bursting with a desire to return." "Strange," he muttered. "Very, very strange." "I'll come with you." For a moment he spoke to his daughters as if to reassure them. Then together we walked over the springy turf towards the house by the headland. He seemed in no mood for conversation, and my own mind was far too busy with the tragedy for idle talk. But he asked me one more question when we were about 50 yards from the house. "Rupert Carlingham carried his wife up to the headland, you say?" "Slung her over his shoulder," I answered, and then— But the doctor had stopped short and was staring at the house, while once again every vestige of colour had left his face. "My God," he muttered, "there's a light in the room. A light, man. Don't you see it?" "I left the candles burning," I said impatiently. "Really, Doctor, I suppose murder doesn't often come your way, but this is—" I walked on quickly, and he followed. Really, the fuss was getting on my nerves, already distinctly ragged. The front door was open as I had left it, and I paused for a moment in the cobwebby hall. Then, pulling myself together, I stepped into the room where the body lay, only to halt and stare open-mouthed at the floor. The candles still flickered on the mantelpiece. The furniture was just as I had left it. But of the body of John Trelawney there was not a trace. It had vanished, utterly and completely. "I don't understand, Doctor," I muttered foolishly. "I left the body lying there." The doctor stood at the door beside me, and suddenly I realised that his eyes were fixed on me. "I know," he said, and his voice was grave and solemn. "With the head near that chair, Why? How do you know? I cried, amazed. Have you taken the body away? But he answered my question with another. Do you notice anything strange in this room, sir? He asked. On the floor? Only a lot of dust, I remarked. Precisely, he said, and one would expect footprints in dust. I see yours going to the mantelpiece. I see no others. I clutched his arm as his meaning came to me. My God, I whispered. What do you mean? I mean, he said, that Rupert Carlingham murdered John Trelawney and then killed himself and his wife 5 years ago, during just such another storm as we have had this evening.